So how did Trump become Trump? Who influenced him? And how did he become the man that he is today? Loaded question, I grant you. But Politico magazine, they gathered 5 so-called Trumpologists and asked them to give a masterclass on the Donald. So joining us now is the guy who wrote that piece, Politico senior writer Michael Kruse. Michael, thanks for a few. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it is an interesting portrait that comes out of it. One of the constant refrains from all of them is this is a needy guy and an insecure guy about how the world sees him, let alone even go from early years, how even his own family perceived him.
You know, these 5 biographers, the 5 major biographers of Trump over the last several decades, they all agreed that if nothing else, Donald Trump is happier than he's ever been right now because of the amount of attention that is coming his way. He is a guy who has been trying to fill a hole of sorts that is inside him for decades, and the way he does that, they told us, is by attention, is by attracting attention, and right now he's attracting more attention than he ever has.
You know, one of the things that was really interesting for me was, and there's been a debate as to how much his father either funded him in the beginning, but no matter what, it's clear from every single biographer, the old man, he signed all the checks to all the big deals in the early years, and Trump could move ahead unless Fred actually put pen to paper here, not just giving him the funds, but authorizing it, in effect, with lines of credit. He was much more of a vital role in terms of the early years of Trump, the developer, than I think a lot of people imagine.
Absolutely. He is not a self-made man. He's a self-made character, and there's an important distinction there. What he has done is create this character and stoke this character for several decades by now. What is true, though, is that at the beginning especially, he could not have done what he did without his father. Not only without his father's money, but without his father's political connections, without his father's credit. His father, Fred C. Trump, who was a very, very rich man in his own right in the middle of the 20th century and into the 70s and 80s, created a situation where his son didn't really have to weigh risk the way that most of us would. There was always a fallback, and that was Fred C. Trump.
In fact, the number that Trump has said, my father only gave me $1 million or 10, a lot of the folks you spoke to, they put that number more likely at about 150 million, although they really couldn't pin it down.
It's hard to say with any certainty. What is certain, though, is that he could not have done what he did without his father's help.
You know, when talking about the family dynamic, Fred Jr. came up, and we've talked about it on the program, and the Times did a piece on this as well, but there was a complicated relationship, and I know for the folks who profiled him in the past, they were surprised when Donald Trump mentioned his brother in an early campaign victory speech, given, you know, how tragic the ending was for his brother, and also how Donald really tried to stand in the way of his brother's kids getting a piece of the inheritance from the grandfather.
Yeah, it's an interesting relationship. I mean, something that he is not proud of and sort of avoids his relationship with his older brother, Fred's first son, Fred's namesake. It's a tough deal that he has tried to stay away from. At the same time, he has said often, Donald has, that he has trusted people less because he thought his older brother trusted people too much. And certainly he has talked at length about how, in some ways, untrusting he is.
You know, in story after story about Trump, the businessman or the builder, the dirty secret is he really hasn't been a builder since the 80s. And you went into detail with these various biographers about not only his spotty record, but just how bad things were in the 90s, where the banks basically said, this is over. I mean, you've run these things into the ground. And then the subject of leverage came up. Give an idea for folks who don't know, even though they'll see Trump's name in front of buildings, what has actually records been, and especially in the last 20, 30 years, the brand versus the builder?
The high point of Donald Trump's career as an actual builder was Trump Tower. It remains Trump Tower, and that is a building that went up in 1983. That is a long time ago. Since then, and in particular since the early 90s, he has been less a builder and more a brand builder. He's been successful at that, and surprisingly successful, given that in the early to mid 90s he was really struggling just to survive and to stay out of personal bankruptcy. Of course, throughout in the early 90s and in 2004 and in 2009 too, he filed for corporate bankruptcy, Chapter 11 bankruptcy. All of those are related to Atlantic City. Those bankruptcies have not seemingly damaged his brand, his image as a good businessman. I think one thing that has been amazingly important for Donald Trump in the last 15 years, and this is something all the biographers talked about, is The Apprentice. The Apprentice sort of wiped clean so many of those business missteps. He is now seen by a large chunk of the populace as the boss, as a successful businessman, not because he actually was or has been for the last 30 years, but because he played one so convincingly on TV.
I want to read a few quotes you put together, and I don't have time for them, but just like a couple of hundred of the most unbelievable quotes that Trump said, just to give a little sampling to our audience. He said in the early 90s, quote, "I have black guys counting my money. I hate it. The only guys that want counting my money are short guys that wear yarmulkes all day." I can't make this up. Let's go to the family part. This was just the icky, creepy thing to me. Quote, "She does have a very nice figure. I've said if Ivanka wasn't my daughter, perhaps I'd be dating her." Ew. He goes on to say more broadly about women, quoting about women, "You have to treat them like," and I can't say the word on TV, but I think people can know where I'm going with that. When it talks about the environment, and this doozy was said less than 4 years ago, the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make the U.S. manufacturing non-competitive. And to kind of put a bow on it, he said, "It's always good to do things nice and complicated so that nobody can figure it out." And to that point, is he just crazy, or is he crazy like a fox? And I ask that because for all the people who say, "Oh, this is part of some grand plan," if you've ever listened to a press conference of his, they're meandering, there's no point to them. He says the same stories over and over. I don't think this is as planned and thought out as people give him credit for, but you followed him closer than I have. What's your answer?
I'm still trying to figure out that answer, and I think all of us are, but here's what I'll say. You know, he is a master, if you want to use this word, manipulator of media. Not the media, but media. He knows that the most important thing to be in modern America, more and more, is interesting. And he has said so many things. He has such a record of saying such outrageous things, certainly that has continued in the last year plus, that we tune in to see what he'll say next. And I think there is some sort of subversive brilliance in some strange way in that there is nothing he could say, maybe, but there is very little he could say that would be more outrageous than what he has already said. So in this respect, he is different from anybody else who is running against him in the Republican primary, certainly different than anybody he would run against in the general election. Most certainly, or most assuredly, Hillary Clinton. He is gaffe-proof because what could he possibly say? What kind of thing could he possibly say that he hasn't already said?
Well, it brings me to my final question. I grant you everything you've said, except you know what's coming. You've probably spoken to some of the same folks I have, the Oppo research team over at Hillary World. They have reams and reams of this stuff, and the biographers are just the tip of the iceberg. Is there a thinking that when the general public gets more of an idea of the stuff that you wrote about and even beyond that, day after day after day from now till November, the crazy uncle kind of appeal that Trump has goes away when they realize this guy could have his finger on the launch codes?
Yeah, you would think. Up until this point, though, in this election, all the things that people like you and me have thought have not turned out to be quite right. And so any sort of declaration of that kind, I think, needs to be hedged a little bit. But what you say is absolutely correct. It is going to be nonstop for the next 6 months. Certainly, this will go both ways, but there is an absolute trove of oppositional research that can be used against Donald Trump.
Michael Kruse, great stuff from Politico. I appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
All right, coming up next, the panel will return and we'll discuss whether Hillary ought to return fire when Trump attacks or take the high road and hope he shoots himself first.